She was a debt to be settled with the dust, a life measured in silver dollars and cheap whiskey. A teenage Comanche girl sold to a stranger until she discovered the rancher who bought her was not a rancher at all, but something else entirely. Before we delve into her story, let us know in the comments where you are watching from, and please subscribe if you want more tales like this one. The sun was a hammer against the anvil of the sky, beating the town of Redemption flat and brittle. It was a place that had forgotten the meaning of its own name, if it ever knew it at all. For Tiva, it was the end of a line drawn in disgrace. She stood on the splintered porch of the trading post, a ghost in her own skin, while her father's last foolish debt was called in. The man who owned the debt, a merchant with eyes like tarnished coins, spoke in low, greasy tones to the buyer. Tiva did not look at the buyer. She looked past him, at the heat shimmering off the dirt street, at the way it warped the world into a fever dream. This was familiar. The world had been warped for a long time. She was property now, a thing to be bartered. The finality of it was a cold stone in her gut, a weight heavier than any grief. She felt the eyes of the townsfolk on her, the pinch-faced women and the slack-jawed men, their judgment a physical force. They saw a savage, a curio, a problem solved. They did not see the daughter who had tried to warn her father, the girl who knew the scent of a trap long before it was sprung. The buyer's voice finally cut through the haze, low and rough like stones grinding together. The price is paid. A hand, calloused and firm, closed around her upper arm. It was not brutal, but it was absolute. Only then did she force her gaze up, to the man who now owned her. He was tall, weathered by the sun, with a face carved from impassive granite. He wore the clothes of a rancher, but his eyes were not empty like the others. They were dark, deep-set, and held a stillness that was more unnerving than cruelty. He was a man who knew how to wait. He was a cage she did not yet understand. The journey from redemption was a silent one, measured in the rhythmic plod of horses' hooves and the creak of saddle leather. The man, this Silas, rode ahead, his back a rigid wall against the vast, indifferent landscape. He had not spoken a word to her since the transaction, had not offered a name or a destination. Tiva followed, her hands bound loosely to her own saddle horn, a gesture that felt more like a test than a true restraint. Her mind, however, was a frantic thing, a trapped bird beating against the bars of her ribs. Every rock formation, every dip in the terrain, was assessed as a potential escape. But to where? The plains stretched out like a punishment, an endless expanse of ochre and pale green under a bleached-out sky. There was no water, no shelter, only the relentless sun and the man ahead of her. She studied him, this so-called rancher. He rode with an unnatural ease, a part of the horse, a part of the land itself. He was watchful, but his attention wasn't on her. His gaze swept the horizon constantly, methodically, as if he were tracking something far more important than his newly acquired property. She was an afterthought, and the thought was a fresh sting of humiliation. Or was it something else? A flicker of confusion. A captor would watch his prize, a master would assert his dominance. Silas did neither. He simply existed ahead of her, a silent, brooding constant. Her hatred for him was a clean, sharp thing, the only feeling that hadn't been dulled by despair. He was the embodiment of her loss, the face of her father's failure, the final link in a chain of betrayals forged by men who saw her people as less than human. She would watch him. She would learn his rhythms, his weaknesses. The silence he offered was a weapon, and she would turn it back on him. In the quiet, she could plot. In the quiet, she could remember the feel of a knife in her hand. The sun began to dip low, painting the clouds in bruised shades of purple and orange. And still they rode on, deeper into nowhere. The ranch, when they finally reached it, was not what she had expected. It was less a home and more a fortress, nestled in a shallow, defensible basin, walled in by stark mesas on three sides. There were no sprawling herds of cattle, only a handful of hardy-looking longhorns in a well-mended corral. There was a small, solid-looking house built of stone and rough-hewn timber, a barn and a well. That was all. An air of profound isolation hung over the place, a silence even deeper than the one they had carried on the trail. It was the home of a man who did not want to be found, Silas swung down from his horse and, without a word, untied the rope from her saddle horn. The gesture was so casual, so devoid of ceremony, that it caught her off guard. He gestured with his chin toward the house. "You'll stay there." He did not shove her, did not drag her. He simply stated a fact and turned to tend to the horses, leaving her standing alone in the encroaching twilight. Tiva hesitated, her feet rooted to the spot. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but the sheer, calculated emptiness of the landscape held her fast. This was a cage, but its bars were made of distance and desperation. She walked to the house, her body rigid with defiance, and pushed open the heavy wooden door. The inside was as sparse as the outside. A main room with a stone hearth, a table, 2 chairs. A smaller room off to the side held a simple cot with a clean, folded blanket. It was a prison cell, but one without a lock. There was no filth, no squalor, just an unnerving, ascetic cleanliness. It was confusing. It was wrong. She had prepared herself for brutality, for a dirt-floored shed and a life of grim servitude. This quiet, sterile containment was a form of cruelty she hadn't anticipated. It gave her nothing to fight against. No tangible enemy but the man outside and the suffocating silence. She sat on the edge of the cot, the rough blanket a small, abrasive reality. She would not let this place soften her. She would not let its strangeness dull the edge of her anger. She was Tiva. She was a survivor. And this was just another kind of war. Night fell like a shroud over the basin. Tiva lay on the cot, unmoving, listening to the sounds of the house. The creak of floorboards as Silas moved in the other room. The soft sigh of the fire in the hearth settling into embers. She did not sleep. Sleep was a luxury she had lost somewhere on the road to redemption. Instead, she let her mind drift back to the memory that burned behind her eyes. A flashback, sharp and vivid. Her father, a proud man broken by a world that had no place for his pride, standing before the merchant. He wasn't a bad man, just a dreamer who mistook a fox's smile for friendship. He had traded horses, good Comanche stock, for the promise of rifles that never came. A debt was manufactured, inflated with lies and ink on a page he couldn't read. She remembered the shame that had stooped his shoulders, the way his hands, once so steady with a bow, trembled as he signed the paper with an X. She had begged him not to, her gut twisting with a certainty she was too young to articulate. She had seen the greed in the merchant's eyes, but her father, desperate to provide, had waved away her fears. And now he was gone, consumed by a fever of spirit that the white man's medicine couldn't touch, and she was the final payment on his phantom debt. A bitter taste filled her mouth. The memory was a whetstone for her hatred. In the morning, Silas gave her a task, mending a fence at the far end of the corral. He handed her the tools without a word, and watched her for a moment before turning his attention back to the horizon. Always the horizon. As she worked, her fingers clumsy at first, then finding a rhythm, she watched him. He wasn't overseeing her work. He stood by the house, a solitary figure staring east, his posture tense, expectant. He was a man waiting for a signal, for a sign. He was a hunter, but he wasn't hunting anything on this land. His prey was somewhere out there, in the world beyond the mesas. The realization settled in her slowly. His indifference to her wasn't an insult. She was secondary to a much larger purpose. This ranch, this isolation, it was all a part of it. And that purpose, whatever it was, felt dangerous. Days bled into one another, each marked by the same routine of silent chores and watchful tension. Tiva's compliance was a mask for her simmering rebellion. She learned the lay of the land, the placement of every tool that could be a weapon, the cadence of Silas's movements. She was a coiled spring, waiting. The moment of change came on the 5th day. 3 riders appeared at the mouth of the basin, their figures dark against the morning sun. They were not from redemption, but they had the same air of casual menace, the same arrogance. They rode directly to the house, their laughter loud and abrasive in the quiet air. Tiva froze where she was, mucking out the small stable, her heart suddenly a cold, hard knot in her chest. This was it. This was the moment her carefully constructed world of silent observation would shatter. She expected Silas to greet them as kin, to share a drink and a cruel joke at her expense. She expected to be offered up, a prize to be shared or displayed. Instead, Silas emerged from the house, wiping his hands on a rag, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He stood on the porch, blocking the doorway, and simply waited for them to speak. "Howdy, Silas," the leader said, a man with a stained duster and a predatory grin. "Heard you came into some new property." His eyes flicked to Tiva, lingering with a possessive heat that made her skin crawl. Silas didn't even glance her way. His voice, when he spoke, was dangerously low. "You've got no business here, Jed. Just a friendly visit." Jed sneered, his hand drifting toward the pistol on his hip. "Heard a Comanche girl went missing from the reservation up north. A runner, big reward for her." Tiva's breath caught in her throat. Silas's gaze never left the man's face. This one was a debt, paid and settled in redemption. "You know the law." "Sometimes the law gets complicated," Jed pressed. A long, tense silence stretched between them. Silas didn't move, didn't flinch. He just stood there, an immovable object of quiet, lethal authority. Finally, with a frustrated curse, Jed spat on the ground and wheeled his horse around. "Have it your way, rancher, but we'll be keeping an eye out." They rode away, and only when they were gone did Silas seem to relax, the tension leaving his shoulders in an almost imperceptible sigh. He turned and went back inside without a word to her, leaving Tiva standing in the shadows of the stable, her world tilted on its axis. He had protected her. Why? The incident with the riders left a crack in the foundation of Tiva's certainty. He had protected her, not with overt violence, but with a cold, unyielding presence that the other men recognized as a boundary not to be crossed. It made no sense. A man who buys a slave does not then defend her from other predators. The mystery of him deepened, becoming more unsettling than simple malice. She began to watch him with a new kind of intensity, searching for the flaw in his performance, the clue that would explain the contradiction. The opportunity came unexpectedly. Silas announced he was riding the perimeter, a 2-day journey to check for tracks and water sources, leaving her alone at the ranch. The instruction was simple: stay inside after dark. The moment his horse disappeared over the ridge, a frantic energy seized her. This was her chance. Not to escape. She was still a prisoner of the geography, but to understand, to peel back the layers of the man who was her captor and, inexplicably, her protector. She went to his room. It was as sparse as the rest of the house, dominated by a simple bed and a small, scarred wooden chest at its foot. The chest was locked. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She worked at the simple iron lock with the tip of a mending needle, her fingers trembling. Took an eternity, but finally she heard a soft click. She lifted the heavy lid. The contents were not what she expected. No gold, no weapons, no ledgers from his life as a rancher. Instead, nestled in a worn leather pouch, was a single object: a child's moccasin. It was small, intricately beaded in a pattern she recognized instantly, a design unique to the Quahati band of Comanche, her people. She stared at it, her mind reeling. The beadwork was precise, the pattern a story of sky and eagle. Below it, tucked into a fold of the leather, was a small, crudely carved wooden horse, its form almost identical to the ones her own brother used to carve before he was taken by the sickness. A wave of vertigo washed over her. This was not the property of a white rancher. This was a relic, a memory, a secret kept buried in the heart of his fortress. Who was Silas? This man of stone and silence, who kept a piece of her past locked away like a prayer. The mystery of him was no longer just a question of motive. It was a question of identity. The sky began to curdle 2 days later, the blue bruising to a sullen, angry gray. The wind picked up, a low moan that grew into a keening shriek, whipping dust and grit against the small stone house. A storm was coming, a proper plain storm, the kind that scoured the land clean. Silas returned just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall, his horse lathered and his face grim. He secured the animals in the barn with a practiced efficiency, his movements economical and swift, and then retreated into the house, bolting the door against the rising fury of the wind. The storm trapped them together. The small house, once a symbol of her confinement, now felt suffocatingly intimate. The air grew thick with unspoken things. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled like a hungry wolf, isolating them completely from the outside world. Diva sat at the table, ostensibly mending a shirt, but her focus was entirely on him. Silas stood by the hearth, staring into the flames, lost in a world of his own. The discovery of the moccasin had changed everything. She no longer saw a white rancher, a captor. She saw a puzzle, a man living a lie. The silence between them was different now. It was no longer just empty space. It was charged with the weight of her discovery and his hidden past. As the storm reached its zenith, a bolt of lightning struck nearby. The crack of thunder so immediate and violent it shook the very foundations of the house. In the disorienting flash of white light, Tiva saw his face clearly. For a fleeting second, the mask of the stoic rancher fell away, and she saw a profound, ancient sorrow in his eyes, a flicker of a pain so deep it seemed a part of his soul. Then, in the ensuing darkness, before he could recompose himself, he muttered a single word under his breath, a word he thought the thunder had swallowed. Pia Tava, big storm. He had said it in Comanche. The word, a piece of her own tongue, hung in the air between them, more shocking than the lightning, more resonant than the thunder. Tiva's needle froze in her hand. Her head snapped up, her eyes locking with his across the dim, fire-lit room. The secret was out, exposed in a single, unguarded moment. The rancher, Silas, was a ghost. The storm outside mirrored the tempest that had broken inside the small stone house. The Comanche word hung between them, an accusation and a revelation. Silas, or whoever he was, looked at her, his face for the first time completely stripped of its impassive mask. He looked haunted. The riders, Jed and his men, chose that moment to return. They burst from the curtain of rain like demons, their horses churning the mud, their shouts barely audible over the wind's howl. "Silas, we know you're in there. We know what you are." Jed's voice was laced with a triumphant rage. They had found their proof. They weren't hunting a runaway girl anymore. They were hunting him. Silas moved, his body transforming in an instant. The slow, deliberate movements of the rancher vanished, replaced by the fluid, coiled grace of a warrior. He grabbed a rifle from above the mantelpiece. "Stay back," he commanded Tiva, his voice low and urgent, the voice of a man born to give orders in the face of death. He unbolted the door and stepped onto the porch, into the teeth of the gale. "You were warned," he yelled over the wind. "She's stolen property," Jed screamed back, his men fanning out, their pistols drawn. "From the reservation. You're a runner, just like her." "She is not stolen," Silas roared, his voice carrying with impossible power. "She is ransomed. There is a difference." Tiva watched from the shadows of the doorway, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She saw Jed raise his pistol, but Silas was faster. He didn't fire the rifle. Instead, he dropped it, and in the same motion, drew a long knife from a sheath hidden at the small of his back. He moved with a speed that was inhuman, closing the distance between the porch and the riders in a blur. He fought not like a white man, but like a Comanche. He used their aggression, their momentum against them, a whirlwind of calculated, brutal efficiency. When it was over, two men were on the ground, groaning, and Jed was disarmed, staring in disbelief at the man holding a blade to his throat. Silas leaned in close, his voice a deadly whisper. "My name is not Silas. It is Nokona. And this is not a ranch. It is a sanctuary. Now get off my land before I send you to your gods." He let Jed go, and they fled, scrambling into the storm like cowards. Nokona turned back to the house, his chest heaving, rain plastering his hair to his face. He looked at Tiva, the truth finally laid bare in his eyes. "I buy our people back," he said, his voice raw with a generation of pain. "I bring them home." The confession settled in the quiet aftermath of the violence. The storm began to recede, its fury spent, leaving a world washed clean and trembling. Nokona. His real name felt strange on her tongue, yet it fit him more perfectly than Silas ever could. He was a ghost from his own past, a Comanche boy taken, raised as a white man who had clawed his way back to a life of purpose, using the tools of his captors against them. His ranch was a way station. Redemption wasn't the end of the line for her. It was the beginning of a different path, a new kind of underground railroad forged in the heart of enemy territory. He explained it all, his voice low and steady now, the story tumbling out as if a dam had broken. He used his inheritance, the land and money from the white family that had raised him, to legally purchase his people out of indentured servitude, out of prisons, out of the hopeless fringe towns like Redemption. He gave them a choice, a path north to the free territories or a way south into Mexico. He gave them back what had been stolen. He gave them a chance to be people again. As he spoke, Tiva felt the hard shell of her own hatred begin to crack. The anger that had been her shield, her only warmth, was dissolving, leaving behind a raw and aching vulnerability. Everything she thought she knew had been a lie constructed to protect a truth more incredible than she could have imagined. He was not her enemy. He was her kin. The realization was a staggering blow. He finished his story and looked at her, his eyes holding a question he did not dare to ask aloud. The choice was now hers. The path north was open. He would give her a horse, supplies, a map. She could be free, truly free, within a week. The thought of it was a dizzying pull. Freedom, a life for herself, away from the pain, away from the fight. But as she looked at him, at the profound loneliness in his eyes, at the immense weight of the burden he carried all by himself, she saw her own reflection. She saw the little brother who carved wooden horses, the father who died of a broken spirit. Leaving would be an escape. Staying would be a reckoning. Her life had been defined by what was taken from her. For the first time, she was being offered a chance to define it by what she could give back. She stood there in the quiet room, the scent of rain and wet earth filling the air. The entire world balanced on the point of her decision. Freedom was a siren's call, a promise of a life unburdened by the ghosts of her people. To ride north, to forget the name Tiva and the girl who was sold to settle a debt, to become someone new, someone who had never known the inside of a cage. It was the sensible choice, the choice a survivor would make. Her entire life had been a lesson in survival, in putting her own needs first because no one else would. She thought of her father, of his foolish pride and his tragic end. He had tried to fight the world, and the world had broken him. Running seemed like wisdom, and yet she looked at Nocona. He was not broken. He was wounded, yes, scarred by a life lived between two worlds, belonging to neither, but he was fighting back in a way her father never could. He was not just surviving, he was creating a sanctuary. He was turning the enemy's weapons, their laws, their money, their language, into tools of liberation. He was a warrior of a new age. To leave him now would feel like a betrayal deeper than any she had ever suffered. It would be abandoning the only person who had ever truly seen her, not as property, not as a savage, but as kin. The anger that had sustained her was gone, and in its place, something new and fragile was taking root. It felt like hope, but it was a fiercer, more demanding thing. It was purpose. She walked to the hearth and picked up the small beaded moccasin she had left on the mantel. She ran her thumb over the familiar pattern, the story of sky and eagle. She held it not as a relic of a dead past, but as a promise for a living future. She turned to face him, her decision made. It settled in her spirit not with a crash, but with a quiet, profound calm. "They will come back for you," she said, her voice clear and steady. It was not a question. Nocona nodded slowly, his eyes searching hers. "Yes, you will need help," she continued. She held out the moccasin. "I know this pattern. I know the stories. I know our people." She took a breath, the first truly free breath of her life. "My place is here." A single tear traced a path through the grime on Nocona's cheek, a crack in the granite. For the first time since she had met him, he smiled. It was a small, broken thing, but it was real, and it was enough.